Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lauren Power, and I'm joining you to offer opening remarks in my capacity as a research fellow at the University of Tokyo. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's seminar on the roles and responsibilities of international financial institutions, or IFIs, beyond COVID-19, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank's innovative features in governance and international standards. According to the UNDP, although we have faced many crises, and each has hit human development hard, overall, development has accrued globally year on year. COVID-19, however, has changed this trend with its triple hit to health, education, and income. In some areas, over a decade of development work has been undone in a little over a year. The pandemic has made achieving the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals tremendously challenging, but it has also provided for us an opportunity to build back better, smarter, and with greater attention to equality and creating a better future for all. International financial institutions can be key instruments in overcoming the unprecedented obstacles of our times and achieving our potential to heal stronger than before. While every IFI can contribute to the shared aim of development, each according to its unique charter and governance structure, they can also work in partnership, at times co-financing and complementing the efforts of one another. Today, we will hear from our esteemed speakers about two IFIs in particular, the Asian Development Bank, or the ADB, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. Let us feel inspired by the progress they have already made and the great power of their future investments in bringing our global community closer to achieving the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Thank you for joining us for a discussion on these important points. Following our keynote and panel discussions, we will reserve time for questions from the audience, as you've already heard. Again, we will be following Chatham House rules. So please feel free to share your questions with us throughout the seminar by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We hope to address as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A. Thank you. I will now invite Professor Yasunori Sato of the University of Tokyo's Human Security Program to take the floor to provide framing remarks for today's seminar. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Yasunori Sato. I'm director of the University of Tokyo Research Center of the Sustainable Peace of the University of Tokyo, and also now the member of the Human Security Program, HSP. So this is a joint seminar of HSP and also the Graduate School of the Public Policy in the Hongo campus. This seminar is actually extension of the our intensive course given by the Dr. Gerard Sanders, in fact, the visiting professor of the University of Tokyo last semester. It was a great session, even such difficulties due to this COVID-19. In fact, he couldn't even arrive in Tokyo, but very kindly to offer to give a lecture whole course from Rome, despite such time difference. We really appreciate it, and this course duly recorded and to be published in the future in our university homepage. So this public seminar is actually the extension for this course, and then we discuss more details, specifically the case of the AIIB's features, which is not so well known in Japan, as you know, because Japan is not a member, and also US is also not a member. So now we are wondering why and what happened next. So in fact, Gerard and myself were colleagues of EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, 1995. So such a long time ago. At the time, I was just a practicing lawyer working in London to this EBRD, European Bank, which is a quite ambitious one. In fact, this was funded by Japanese government to support this European, especially the transition economies, such as command socialistic economy to the market-oriented economies. In fact, it also the promoting the multi-party democracy. So the Japan was quite interested in supporting this process. So I visited many Central Asian countries. In fact, the former Soviet Union was also the member of the country operation. And in such a way, our work especially focusing on law reform assistance, technical cooperation, in fact, to introduce the market-oriented legal systems in order to support this transition process without any good financial law or company law, or not only the business law, such as the civil code, basic legal framework is quite necessary for the transition economies. So I left the bank and then joined in University of London to work PhD. Then I ended up with University Tokyo for teaching. And Gerard is, of course, a long-time friend, and he actually devoted himself to work for this challenge of the world. And now the AIIB, such as quite ambitious banks, and he was a general counsel, headed legal function, the governance of the AIIB, and he promoted to the special advisor to the president of the AIIB. So in this sense, such important, very crucial positions for us to work in the future, cooperate each other for the world, for beyond this divided world to the more sustainable one, especially the how to cope with this COVID-19 with or post COVID-19. We need such a solidarity for the future, human security, these kind of financial tools. Thank you very much. So let's have Gerard, my friend, to the floor as a keynote. Then followed by the panel discussions, including such distinguished guests as Michael, of the former General Counsel of the ADB, Asian Development Bank, and also the Professor Nishizawa, who's my colleague of the GraSPP, and he was also kindly co-hosting this research seminar. So I will moderate this panel discussion. So now, here is Mr. Gerard Sanders. Please, your floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm looking forward to the discussion later on in the seminar. And thank you very much to Lauren and to Professor Sato for the introductory words and for the very kind comments that you made, Professor Sato. I appreciate that very much. So I'm going to talk today within the confines of the seminar publicity, of course, about multilateral development banks in the age of COVID-19, with particular reference to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and its governance and standards. And I'm going to begin by talking about the responsiveness of multilateral development banks to changing circumstances, most recently COVID-19. So multilateral financial institutions have always played a key role in development. Over successive generations, they have helped shape the development agenda and supported their client members, principally through financing programs and projects and providing other forms of assistance. To remain relevant, they have had to be adaptive, responding to the changing needs of members. We continue to see this today, with all the major institutions significantly ramping up support to their members to address the impact of COVID-19. In the case of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example, lending and other investments in 2020 more than doubled over the previous year to approximately $10 billion of new approvals. 2/3 of last year's investment has been in response to the pandemic, with much of the support having gone to the least developed members of AIIB. These poor countries are especially vulnerable to health and economic shocks, and particularly in time of crises, their alternative sources of financing are limited. This additionality of the multilateral development banks being ready to contribute financing that others cannot or will not is a crucial test of their continuing relevance. As a demonstration of this readiness, we may note that after almost every global financial crisis in the last several decades, the MDBs have substantially increased operational investment in order to meet the resultant challenges. Crises can also change priorities, both on the part of developmentally or financially distressed members and on the part of the institutions set up to support them. The current crisis, for example, has highlighted how important the health of the population is to the economy, with the AIIB, for instance, having ventured into providing emergency financing in the health sphere, while simultaneously developing a sector strategy for longer-term engagement in this and other social areas. The MDBs, then, are often most active in a crisis at a time when other financiers are in retreat. The intensity of this counter-cyclicality is a further measure of the MDB's continuing relevance. Indeed, multilateral development banks have often been established in direct response to economic and sometimes political challenges. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, at the heart of the World Bank Group, was created to help rebuild the economies damaged in the Second World War and to foster development of colonies that were becoming independent. The International Financial Corporation came about through a recognition that development would be better achieved by engaging the private sector more directly. The International Development Agency and the International Fund for Agricultural Development were born of the recognition that the needs of the least developed countries can be better met through concessional and grant financing. Regional development banks, like the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, were a response to calls for development to be more localized in its articulation and delivery. This is true also of the most recent of the major international financial institutions, the AIIB, although the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank defies easy characterization, given that with 103 approved members and counting, its ownership is increasingly global. And unlike the regional development banks, the AIIB may invest in all its members, and in exceptional circumstances, in non-members too. While the immediate reasons for the creation of the MDBs are varied, the multilateral financial institutions are all born into the family of IFIs, and they share the same broad purpose. The specific terms of their mandates may vary, but they are all ultimately concerned with improving lives, especially of people living in countries that need the most help. So, for example, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank retain a focus on alleviating poverty, while the AIIB seeks to improve social and economic outcomes. This consistency in purpose is accompanied by a further common feature of multilateral development banks, namely their alignment with certain global policy objectives. And Lauren mentioned these in her introduction. Most notably here are the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing Development, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This can be partly attributed to the close association that the major international financial institutions have with the United Nations, the world's principal development body, as sponsor of these three initiatives. Indeed, several multilateral development organizations are UN specialized agencies, and a number have observer status at the UN, including the AIIB, whose status, incidentally, as an observer in the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council was co-sponsored by Japan. This notion of a family of MDBs is premised on their many similarities and their readiness to work together in a broadly common cause. We have already noted the shared concern with development. Furthermore, all MDBs are intergovernmental organizations whose membership is distinct from the institution itself. Control is a function of ownership, with the number of voting shares being allocated primarily with reference to economic power, but with adjustments to ensure that voice is given also to the less economically powerful members. Most MDBs have callable capital, as well as paid-in capital, an arrangement that gives comfort to creditors, most notably bondholders. The power to borrow, along with other critical powers, such as the power to lend and invest, is usually stated expressly in the constituent agreement. Nonetheless, by virtue of public international law, the law under which all international organizations are created and by which they are governed, MDBs enjoy such implied powers, not inconsistent with the express terms of their constituent charters, as are necessary for the pursuit of their mandates. Public international law also determines the status of MDB staff as international civil servants, whose loyalties are to the organization alone, and provides content to their contracts of employment. Additional content, as well as regulation, in this and other spheres, are also provided by members and reflected in the constituent agreements of MDBs. Of significance here are the status, privileges, immunities, and exemptions extended by members to the organization, its personnel and assets, as well as its activities. Also important are core aspects of governance, in particular, the vesting in the Board of Governors, however named, of all the powers of the institution, and the establishment of a Board of Directors and Presidency with defined and limited powers and responsibilities. These features then are broadly shared by all MDBs. But the notion of a family of MDBs does not imply that all members are identical. Some differences reflect choices made from competing operational models. For instance, the IBRD is confined to lending to sovereigns, while the IFC may invest only in the private sector. In the case of the EBRD, it may only invest in the public sector in limited cases, such as in support of privatization or the building of infrastructure necessary for private sector development. The AIIB, by contrast, has substantial flexibility regarding clients, project nature, and investment instruments. Sometimes, differences among MDBs are attributable to institutional structures evolving. For example, the Asian Development Bank was the first to introduce the concept of special funds, monies held and controlled and expended by the institution, but separately so from the ordinary capital resources. Special funds were subsequently adopted by the EBRD and in turn the AIIB. Changes in governance can also be explained in evolutionary terms. Turning to the most recent of the major IFIs, namely the AIIB, some governance features are those broadly shared by all MDBs and which we have discussed earlier. For example, the establishment of 3 tiers of governance bodies and the prescribed bases for allocating votes. Some governance features adopted by AIIB from other institutions represented innovation today. For instance, unlike the case at the IBRD, but as is the case at the EBRD, a director at AIIB representing a constituency of several members need not cast all of the combined votes of the constituency in the same manner. Similarly, the AIIB has also copied IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, in having a non-resident board, and, like several other institutions, has members on its audit committee that are external to the institution. However, other AIIB governance features are unique. There are 3 that are especially noteworthy. First is in relation to the election of the president. While all MDBs provide a mechanism for the election of the executive head, the AIIB articles go a step further and call for the election of the president in accordance with an open, transparent, and merit-based process. Consistent with this provision, the Board of Governors has approved standing election rules which provide detailed content to this requirement. The election of the incumbent AIIB president to serve a 2nd term followed these rules. Unlike at other MDBs, the election rules have been published, further underscoring the AIIB's commitment to transparency. Secondly, in relation to the oversight mechanism in the Charter, while the experience of MDBs has led to the need to adopt various mechanisms to ensure oversight of the institution, the AIIB is unique in elevating this practice to a legal requirement and entrenching it in the articles. Consistent with this provision, the AIIB has established a dedicated unit reporting directly to the Board of Directors, and which is entrusted with evaluating projects and learning from them. The unit also handles complaints by third parties, asserting that the AIIB has not adhered fully to its own safeguard policies, notably those in the social, environmental, and procurement spheres. In addition, the oversight mechanism strengthens the AIIB's audit functions and staff grievance processes. And thirdly, in relation to the accountability framework. While power to approve financing proposals resides primarily with the Board of Directors at all MDBs, the constituent agreement of the AIIB is unique in specifically anticipating the possibility of delegating this authority to the President. Such delegation has now been put in place, with project approval authority being progressively transferred to the President. Accompanying this, a process has been adopted to assess the performance of the President in carrying out the responsibilities delegated to him, and indeed in carrying out his duties generally. This scheme seeks to more clearly demarcate responsibilities of the 2 governance bodies, with the Board of Directors setting strategies and policies and holding the President to account, while the President is given the space to manage the work of the institution, including, critically, its investment operations. Taken in their totality, the above described features of AIIB, embedded in the charter of the institution or adopted by its governance bodies, represent a modern and, in my view, progressive governance framework. Governance is about the allocation and exercise of power in decision-making, the manner in which those decisions are informed, and the means by which the institution is held to account for its decisions. Good governance, as reflected in the Charter and decisions of AIIB, ensures that power is distributed rationally and that there are no structural impediments to it being exercised responsibly, that decisions are transparently and soundly made, and that the institution is accountable not only to its members, but to those affected by its actions. Ultimately, good governance is demanded by the rule of law, a tenet which arguably is embedded in customary international law and binding as such on all MDBs. A natural consequence of an institution adhering to high standards of governance is that it should follow high standards in carrying out its functions, including its investment activities. This is manifested in several ways at AIIB. First, the AIIB operates transparently. Its financial statements are prepared and presented in accordance with international financial reporting standards and audited in accordance with international standards on auditing. It has a public disclosure policy whose basic premise is that all documents may be made public unless there are compelling and defined reasons for not disclosing. The AIIB website provides comprehensive information about the institution, including the governance processes in action, strategies and policies under consideration, and investment and other decisions contemplated and made. Secondly, AIIB personnel are recruited following an open, transparent, and merit-based process. Many of them come from comparator organizations and so are familiar with the standards demanded of an international organization. There are no national quotas at AIIB, although hiring decisions may take into account the desirability of recruiting on a wide geographical basis. Unlike at most other MDBs, recruitment at AIIB is not confined to nationals of member states. Accordingly, AIIB staff includes nationals, for example, of the United States and Japan, even though neither country is a member. Thirdly, AIIB strategies, and especially policies, are broadly aligned with those of other MDBs. This is explained by several factors, including the high degree of shareholder complementarity across the various institutions, the practice of seeking the views of an informed public when formulating these documents, especially the views of civil society organizations that increasingly operate internationally and have consistent demands of all the MDBs, and the desire to set and follow standards that are demanded by all stakeholders, including donors and rating agencies. An important measure of the state of governance of the AIIB and the level of standards it follows is the judgment of others. Several aspects may be mentioned here. First, the AIIB now has 103 approved members, with other applicants expressing an interest in membership. Almost 1/2 of these approved members applied for membership after the institution began operating, an action that suggests that the applicants are satisfied with the governance and standards operating at the institution they wish to join. Secondly, the AIIB has been granted observer status at the United Nations, a reflection of the respect of the international community generally towards the institution. That status was extended to AIIB based on consensual support at the 6th Committee, where all members of the UN are represented. Thirdly, AIIB is able to attract as members of its International Advisory Panel highly regarded individuals with a track record of achievement in carrying out senior governance functions. This includes former heads of government and central banks, including from non-member countries like Japan. Fourthly, several members have entrusted the AIIB with additional funds beyond their capital payments, suggesting confidence that the governance around the preservation, use, and reporting on the resultant special funds will be to a high standard. In passing, let me note that a country does not need to be a member to make a contribution to the AIIB special funds, a convenient means by which governance can be observed without having to commit capital. Fifthly, AIIB works closely with the major MDBs, including in co-financing projects. Co-financiers have sufficient confidence in AIIB that, in many instances, there is agreement that the policies and accountability mechanisms of the co-financier may be applied in relation to the funding provided by AIIB. Here, let me add that the relationship among MDBs is primarily one of collaboration rather than competition. This is because the operational standards are comparable and the size or risks of projects are sometimes such that no MDB can responsibly finance them alone. An example of this is that AIIB extends, alongside IBRD and ADB, policy-based loans to countries most afflicted by COVID-19, with the AIIB relying on its co-financier to prepare and implement the projects, given their experience with this product. Sixthly, and finally, among the key factors considered by rating agencies when assessing MDBs is the quality of governance at the institution. In this respect, all three major rating agencies have assigned AIIB the highest possible rating. So, by way of a concluding remark, let me say that multilateral financial institutions have always played an important role in supporting development. This has never been more so than in times of crises. The current pandemic is a case in point, where MDBs have substantially increased the financial support available to their members, particularly the least developed countries. Multilateral development banks remain relevant. As other sources of development funding become scarce, the MDBs find themselves countercyclically more active than ever. A recent feature in this landscape is the substantial provision by AIIB of fast dispersing policy-based lending to its most needy members. This is a product delivered through co-financing with the IBRD and the ADB, a product that the institution has not previously financed, but which is a timely and meaningful response to the pandemic. This agility is traceable to the governance bodies of AIIB in action. The actions of the board of directors and of the president are simultaneously empowered by the governance arrangements in place at AIIB and constrained by them. An important constraining element is that approved financing must be structured and delivered in a manner consistent with high standards, including as they relate to environmental and social issues, as well as modalities enabling the institution to be held accountable for its decisions. These dictates of good governance and high standards flow directly from the determination of the AIIB to be an effective and responsible multilateral development bank, and from the expectation and confidence placed in the institution by its members and other stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gerard. It's an excellent presentation and very clear and comprehensive. So let's start panel discussion. I will be moderate this session, and first commentator, may I call Professor Nishizawa? Nishizawa Sensei, can you join?
Thank you very much, Professor Sato. Could you open the slide? While preparing the slide, let me express my appreciation on behalf of Graduate School of Public Policy to invite me as one of the panelists. I'm so glad and also honored to join former general counsels of leading MDBs in Asia. I'm so much privileged to play that role. Well, let me start. Well, thank you, Mr. Professor Sanders, for a very comprehensive presentation. And I'm sure that your presentation clarified that every key elements of AIIB. I remember it was 2014 or 15. I started hearing news about AIIB, And I was really curious personally. One of the reasons is 30 years ago, well, from now, that I was involved in creation of EBRD as a member of a Japanese government delegation to negotiate the establishment of EBRD. And so I was really lucky. I had a chance to witness kind of a big change in world history. So EBRD was established to help transition of Central and East European countries in the post-Cold War era. And the reason why I was very much interested in AIIB is I feel that this is another transition we witness in the world. So I start gathering information about AIIB, and I first visited, I visited with a group of students, Beijing headquarters in February 2018. Well, after the establishment of AIIB. So my comments are based on my experience with communicating with some people there, including Professor Sanders. I first met you in November 2018. We co-hosted, the Professor Sato invited us to co-host the seminar. So first seminar, research seminar took place in November 2018. Okay, so this is an introduction. Sorry, I spent too much time on introduction. So all the key elements of AIIB, the characteristics are clearly presented by Professor Sanders. So I'm going to just comment on selected features from my perspectives. Roles and responsibilities. I would like to mention economic rationale and relevance of MDBs in general terms. And of course, AIIB's economic rationale and relevance. First is provision of international public goods. So this is obvious that AIIB are created to support needed infrastructure for people, which AIIB feature is the project cannot be only in Asia, but other parts of the world. But the project are supposed to benefit Asia. So that is a unique feature. But anyway, provision of international public goods. Counter-cyclical. This is very important role expected to be played by MDBs. If you just check the statistics, it is clear. Net flows, net financial flows are always positive during difficult times. I mean that the net financial flows provided by MDBs. So umbrellas ready for rainy days. This is a role of MDBs as well as AIIB. So I was so impressed by the achievement of AIIB during the past 1 year since, the coronavirus had spread over the world. 10 billion approximately of new approvals, and 2/3 of last year's investment, this amount, has been in response to pandemic. So this is really the exercise of MDBs characterized as umbrella ready for rainy days. And AIIB has been very adaptive, responding to changing needs of members, that as mentioned by Professor Sanders. Next page, please. Governance. as I mentioned earlier, my first visit to AIIB is February 2018 with a group of students. And we had a briefing session by senior staff responsible for communication. I was so impressed by these core values: lean, clean, and green. Very, very clear. And I remember this person, the communication officer, mentioned AIIB want to be a development bank in the 21st century. I don't know whether he said that with some intention, but I was so impressed by that expression. And these three values: lean is operate in an efficient way, clean, zero tolerance to corruption, and green, obviously, helps prevent destruction of the earth. So some more. I just copied and pasted from AIIB annual report 2017. Three values are described here. Recently, well, I looked at the most recent annual report, but the description have changed slightly. But I like these original ones. Very clear, straightforward. I don't know why the slight change in description, but lean, clean, green, very good core values of AIIB. Standards. I found an article from The Economist, November 2014. I just read: critics warn that China-led bank may fail to live up to the environmental, labor, and procurement standards that are essential to the mission of development lenders. Not a small number of people said the same thing. Concern about governance and standards. But as described by Professor Sanders, I think AIIB policies and the standards are broadly aligned with those of other multilateral development banks, because as demanded by all stakeholders, the governance structure the same. So I personally don't think AIIB is something evil. This is authentic international financial institution, multilateral development bank. Expectation or suggestions. I want AIIB to differentiate itself from others. Don't follow other banks. Be unique, be innovative, and that is, I think, a good rationale for AIIB. Differentiate yourself. And second point, stay lean, please. Don't become a big bureaucracy. Stay lean, please. I know ADB, former president, did a lot of efforts to reorganize or make the institution leaner. So AIIB, I want to stay lean, be efficient and effective. And somewhat connected to this, no dumping for volume. Don't be a lost leader. I think if there are many MDBs, just compete with each other for the volume or share, I'm concerned of debt implication. All MDBs are lenders. If they just provide easy money without thinking about quality of projects or programs, whatever. I don't think it would help borrowers. And I found in the most recent annual report this image, and also that the AIIB mission defined its first corporate strategy starting this year until 2030. Infrastructure for tomorrow, I42. And this image, I was surprised to see not only lean, clean, green, but there are 6 additional symbols. I don't like, actually, to be honest with you, I don't like putting too many core values. I think more focused one is my preference, personal preference. Don't follow other MDB's way of promoting their image and operations. I think I want AIIB to be very unique, innovative, and MDB in the 21st century. Many people ask whether Japan will join AIIB as a member country. And I found this article in the Financial Times, 2015. Interesting. Speaking to reporters after cabinet meeting, Mr. Aso, finance minister, still finance minister, said Japan could consider entering talks on joining the AIIB if some of its concerns about lending standards and banks' governance were addressed. Well, but the second part is very interesting. Other officials wrote back on the comments, implying that Mr. Aso misspoke. Oh. We are cautious about joining, said Yoshihide Suga, current prime minister, then the chief cabinet secretary. Minister Aso's position is the same. I think his point was that participation is impossible to the extent that these problems are not resolved. As I said, I think many of the concerns are not concerns anymore. But I'm not sure whether it's a feasible and good choice for Japan to join AIIB now as a member. Maybe over the longer term, that option could be a real option, but I personally think that the constructive competition between international financial institutions for quality to help accomplish long-term goals, including SDGs of the stakeholders. I think this is more productive and also feasible. And I prefer constructive competition among MDBs in Asia, AIIB, ADB, and to some extent the World Bank. Of course, collaboration, but also constructive competition. Thank you very much. These are my comments.
Thank you very much, Nishizawa-san. It's a very much to the point, in fact, and also with controversies, just evil, probably, just to be a point, everyone just be concerned about. In fact, this, yeah, some government officers also commented there because of the Chinese policy for the Belt and Road Initiative. AIIs sometimes criticized for this sound banking rules, something like that. So in this sense, some sort of confusions or suspicions, probably, maybe this could be cleared by Gerard. In fact, this to the point of the asked some audience, I will just let this person to ask later. And before that, we should pass on Arthur Mike for the former ADB General Counsel, who is actually the as Professor Nishizawa mentioned, some sort of a competitor or some overlap, and so how we will just harmonize for these two banks in the same Asian regional something anyway. So Arthur is now living in Tokyo, and in fact, I think who is a senior partner of the wanted case, such as prestigious global law firm. And also, he's also the American lawyer. So in this sense, I'm very much interested in the topic. And so please, Arthur, it's your floor, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Sato. I'm honored to be, I very much appreciate this opportunity to speak. I was general counsel from 2003 to 2007, and it was one of the highlights of my 45-year career as a lawyer so far. I really learned a lot and came to understand that MDBs provide a very useful function. I think there's an interesting history here and different governance models, and I want to come back to that. This really is a key question. The World Bank, of course, was established in 1947, and it had a certain governance model, if you will. And then the next generation was the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American, and the African Bank. And then we had EBRD, which both of you were involved with. And then now AIIB. And of course, there are many other institutions. It's kind of interesting today that Professor Nishizawa is Japanese, I'm an American, but our countries are not members of IAIB. I think one of the reasons is that very early on, there was quite a bit of doubt about the governance framework. And I think it's very good now that the bank has about 5 years of experience to reflect on that. And it's very good to have input from Gerard. I stepped away a minute to get my copy of the ADB charter. When I read this for the first time, it was very hard to understand. What in the world is this all about? And you really can't understand the document until you're living in the institution, I think. So what I want to say is that I think there was probably a good bit of misunderstanding at the beginning of this movement here to establish the bank. I think it has, as I understand it, and I think Gerard can attest to this, the AIIB charter was in many ways modeled on the ADB charter, but with certain exceptions. Also, I understand that many of the policies and procedures actually were made with reference to ADB's policies and procedures, and maybe some others as well. So that's what it says on paper. I think the question that many have had in the past is to what extent is the government of China, what extent does it have, what kind of influence does it have over the policies and procedures as a practical matter? And so I want to address, I have a few comments and a few questions, and I'd like to just put them into two different piles and then ask Gerard or Professor Nishizawa to comment. So the first is, obviously, capitals have influence over the organization. In the case of ADB, certainly Japan and the United States have a big voice there. So I think the initial fear was, what sort of voice would China have in the operation of the bank? I suppose it's, well, the question is it the same or is it different? Lauren, when she started off, talked about Build Back Better. Of course, that was President Biden's slogan. But just recently, let's see, the Secretary of State of the U.S. stated that the principles governing U.S. policy would be global health, good governance, and climate cooperation. So that's sort of in sync very much with, it seems to me, the values and the operational principles of the bank. And there may be an opportunity going forward. Now, obviously, China and the U.S. have big geopolitical differences at this stage, but there probably is room for cooperation, and I'd like to see if ADB as well as AIIB will participate in that. So that's one area. Secondly, poverty reduction is one of the stated policies of ADB and others. Although AIIB talks about improvement of social and economic outcomes. Is that the same or is that different? And then also, Gerard, you spoke about policy loans. Now, ADB gives policy advice to various developing member countries. And so is there, what are you doing in terms of policy advice? And I think with the advent of COVID, certainly AIIB seems to be moving in that direction. And of course, I think the charter, both charters prohibit political considerations in determining loans, but how does the bank deal with that sort of situation, let's say in countries like Myanmar? That's my first group of questions, if you will.
All right, Arthur, so now you be stopped now, and then just stand still, then get a response from the Gerald. All right, okay, Gerald. Okay, so after the comments from Nishizawa-san and Arthur, can you respond to these comments first?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sato. Yes, very, very happy to do that. There was a lot of issues covered, so I will do my best to pick up on the main things. So the first is with regard to the issue of Japanese membership that Professor Nishizawa raised. So Japan is eligible to be a member of AIIB. To be eligible under the Charter, an applicant has to be either a member of either the Asian Development Bank or the IBRD. And clearly Japan is a member of both, so it is eligible. And if there was an application, it would be a decision for all the governors. The expectation is that if Japan were to apply, then their application would be very welcome. But of course, it's up to Japan whether they apply or not. So it's a sovereign decision. It's entirely for them to decide. I think that consistent with the need to be apolitical as the institution, I shouldn't say too much there, but I would observe that of all the countries in Asia, all of them are members, with the exception of a few very small states, island states in the Pacific, and with the exception of a few countries which are still in political strife, for example, Yemen and Syria. And I think the only other three Asian countries that are not a member, and we're talking about the Asian continent as defined by AIIB, which is, as the UN would define it, plus all of the Pacific, plus the whole of the Russian Federation. But the only other countries that are not members within Asia are Bhutan, Turkmenistan, and Japan. So lots of little island states in the Pacific, a few countries that have strife, and a few special situations such as Turkmenistan and Bhutan. But then the country that stands out for not being a member is Japan. So membership is the membership application decision is entirely up to Japan, and I'm not really qualified to say whether this is in Japan's best interest or not. But I would say that if there is a concern about governance at the institution or the standards that are followed by the institution, then if those concerns were ever valid, they are not valid now. Let me also say that even though Japan is not a member, the AIIB does cooperate with Japanese entities. So we, in our global bond offering in the United States, we used Japanese banks as part of that transaction. We co-finance projects that have Japanese sponsors We co-finance projects that have the Japanese government as a co-financier. And of course, we work very closely with the Asian Development Bank, in which Japan has a very real influence. We also, as I noted, have some Japanese members on our staff. So we do engage with Japan, but whether Japan determines that membership would best serve its interests, it is a matter for Japan. With regard to the Belt and Road, so there is often some confusion between the AIIB and the Belt and Road, and I think it arises from the fact that they were both Chinese initiatives and they date to about the same time. But they're very different. So the Belt and Road, it's very informal arrangement for countries to be able to work together on terms that suit them in individual cases. So that says something about the fluidity and informality of the arrangement. The AIIB, by contrast, is an international organization. So it's owned by member states. They set the standards, they set the governance arrangements and make sure that they operate. So as a practical matter, what it can mean is that sometimes there will be projects that are on the Belt and Road that the AIIB happens to finance. But in its investment decision-making processes, it's not a consideration for the AIIB whether a project is on the Belt and Road. And for those critics who would say that the AIIB is supporting the Belt and Road and that it's a Belt and Road bank and so forth, I would just point out that the single largest borrower of the AIIB is India, and India is not a great fan of the AIIB. And actually, it's that what I've just said, I think, is also an answer to part answer to Arthur's comment about the concern that some have about the role of China. You know, is China using the AIIB for some geopolitical purpose? I think it is not. Of course, China lay behind the initiative of having the institution, and it has a real interest in seeing an institution which it has promoted and which it hosts being successful. But the best way that China can ensure the success of the AIIB is to allow it to be run to the highest standards of governance and applying the highest international standards in its operations. I think that China, along with the other members of the AIIB, is very supportive of that approach. So if China were using the AIIB to advance some kind of geopolitical interests, again, I don't think we would be having India as the country that has received the most financing. With regard to Arthur's comment about the mandate, so as I said in my presentation, the terms of the mandates are all expressed a little bit differently. But in my view, they all fall within the very broad rubric of development. So poverty is something that doesn't appear in the charter of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and Arthur will know better, but I believe the word does not appear in the charter of the Asian Development Bank either. But when in the communications of those institutions and the strategies of those institutions, then the mission is recast, partly in terms of alleviating poverty. I think currently at the IBRD is about eliminating extreme poverty and also by ensuring a more equitable distribution of the benefits of development. And again, these reflect current objectives, and they're all consistent with the charter provisions, but they are all, in my view, different dimensions of development. And the AIIB the discussion is not about poverty. Of course, poverty is important, but the view is that if the AIIB is very focused in doing what it's been set up to do, namely to finance infrastructure and other productive sectors for the purposes of fostering growth, enhancing connectivity, furthering development, then this, of course, will have a knock-on effect on alleviating poverty. But the focus is very much on financing infrastructure and other productive sectors for the purposes of enhancing growth, development, and connectivity across countries and regions. But there is enough in the objectives of the institutions to characterize them, as I said in my presentation, as a family of MDBs. And it enables them to work together. And at the AIIB, in the very early days, the bulk of what AIIB did was in the nature of co-financing. So the very first projects that were co-financed were projects with the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the World Bank. And over time, as the institution has become a bit larger, it's been able to pursue more projects in isolation. And especially in the private sector, it's expected that over time, the majority, the bulk of the projects will be standalone. So in the corporate strategy that was mentioned earlier, it's expected that by the end of this decade, at least half of the bank's investments will be in the private sector. And while the bank does co-finance with the IFC and the EBRD, I would expect that, and I think the bank's expectation is that the bulk of what the bank will be doing will be in terms of standalone projects. But co-financing will always be there. And co-financing will always be there because sometimes the institutions have their own constraints. So while the AIIB does not have country limits, some institutions, I believe the ADB and the World Bank, they will have limits on how much they can invest in each country. So the limits may be reached or close to being reached or being compromised if a particular project proposal proceeds without being co-financed. And in those circumstances, for the ADB or the World Bank, co-financing will be attractive because it will enable those institutions to ensure their capacity to continue to invest. There will be other instances where the risks of the project are just too great, and so they need to be shared, and there are not private parties willing to take on those risks. So there will be a co-financing. AIIB saw that quite early on in its existence when the TANAP project, running across several countries, including Turkey and Azerbaijan, was co-financed by several international financial institutions, including the EBRD and the World Bank and the AIIB, and I believe others. So I think co-financing will always be with us, and I think it's made possible because of that broad commonality of purpose. And co-financing also provides opportunities for the AIIB to be innovative, as Professor Nishizawa was calling for. So one example of this is that at the AIIB, we have the flexibility when co-financing, with the agreement of the co-financier, to use the core policies of that co-financier. So if we're co-financing something with the ADB or the World Bank, then we can use the environmental and social policies of those institutions. We can use the accountability mechanisms of those institutions. This makes it easier for the clients because they only have to deal with one set of rules and one mechanism. So it achieves a lot of efficiencies, and it's consistent with the lean mantra. So that's an example of innovation at the AIIB. And the two final questions, one about policy advice and the other about being apolitical. So policy advice is especially important for some of the institutions. I would say increasingly over the decades, clients look to the World Bank because of its knowledge, its experience, its insights, and less so its financing capabilities, because increasingly there are other sources of financing available from the other multilateral institutions. At some organizations, policy advice is also important. At the EBRD, I think the EBRD, like the World Bank, probably has the most advanced legal reform programs, and it's very mature, and it's very extensive, and there are a lot of people working on this, and it's something that the EBRD is associated with. So, and that was a decision reflecting the perceived needs of the institution, that there was a great need to help build up institutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in particular, especially after the Russian financial crisis of the late 1990s. So that's why the EBRD did that. Now, the AIIB, the view has been taken that, consistent with the lean mantra, consistent with the focus on infrastructure and other productive sectors, then the bank would prefer to finance projects that are immediately ready to be financed. Now, the reality is that few projects fall into that category, and some countries need assistance in preparing projects for AIIB financing consideration. And as a response to that need, the AIIB has set up a special fund, one of the purposes of which is to assist the least developed countries in preparing projects for financing. But to date, the bank has retained this very tight focus, and it has not gone very far upstream. Maybe this will change over time. The current corporate strategy leaves open the possibility of the bank remaining responsive and agile and flexible, but there is no appetite at the bank or among its members to venture in a very substantial way into upstream work and to provide policy advice to its members and to provide technical assistance and so forth. The work that the AIIB has been doing, co-financing with the ADB and the World Bank, and helping alleviate the impact of COVID-19, is in the form of providing a product which is sometimes labeled as budget support and other times as policy advice and so forth. And indeed, this is an area that the bank does not know well and had not previously ventured into. So as a condition that it set itself to providing this kind of support, it has required that the provision of this kind of lending only be made available where there is leadership provided by either the World Bank or the ADB, which have much more experience in those areas. So we'll see what happens after COVID-19 subsides, how much this experience impacts the continuing evolution of the AIIB. One thing we already sense is that the pandemic has made the AIIB, and I think others, much more aware, as I said in my presentation, about how important health is to economic welfare. And so we are currently working on a strategy in the social sphere, and that would encompass both health and education and other spheres also. So this is one of the lasting impacts of the experience of helping provide finance during the period of COVID-19. And finally, on the apolitical note, then like most international organizations, the AIIB has a charter provision requiring that only economic considerations be taken into account when making investment decisions. The EBRD is an exception. It's actually required to take into account political considerations, namely to what extent are the recipient countries implementing certain ideals, certain liberal ideals that are entrenched in the charter and which really are at the core of the EBRD. But that's the exception. So the AIIB really falls into the classic mold of being prohibited from taking into account in its investment decisions anything other than economic considerations. Now, of course, as we know from experience, and as the other, and I'm sure Arthur can talk to this as well, it's easier to say that than to implement it in practice. And what are economic considerations? For a long time, corruption, which is a big problem in many parts of the world, including in Asia, this was something that was sort of viewed as being off limits for the international financial institutions because it was too closely associated with how countries manage themselves, and dealing with corruption might be viewed as interfering in domestic affairs. But this really changed at the World Bank, I think, in the 1980s. Up to then, it was the only concern of the World Bank was to make sure that its own funds were used properly, but it didn't really venture into this sphere. But I give that as an example of how difficult it is to draw the line between what is an economic consideration and what isn't. The one other point I would add here is that the AIIB has adopted a policy which it calls an international relations policy. Aspects of it were mandated by the basic documents of the bank. So we were required to put something in place, but it's probably a bit more expensive than what was initially contemplated as being minimum requirements. And the international relations policy deals with a number of issues, one of which is international sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council. A second one is the dealing of projects that are on disputed territories. And thirdly, international waterways, and finally dealing with de facto governments. And without going into detail in any of these, I would say that that most of the international relations policy is about trying to avoid difficult areas. I mean, the demands for projects, the demands for financing, it's so great that the bank doesn't want to get caught up in controversy. And so the policy is really designed to keep the bank away from that. So in the case of disputed territories, there can be some process to ascertain how genuine or how entrenched the dispute is, or whether there is a prospect for the bank to be accommodated in financing a project without passing judgment on the claims of the parties. So there is some scope for that, but by and large, the policies are designed to keep AIIB away from controversy, and that is consistent with its apolitical mantra. Thank you, Chia.
Thank you, Gerard, very much, sir. So the Arthur and Professor Nishizawa, any respond, or I think you covered almost all the questions which is made by the audience, Mr. Norman Tang or so on. But also, if you want to add any, yes, Toshiro.
Just a few additional comments. Concerns over governance and standards are not valid. That from my observation, that is my current thought. And mixing up BRI, AIIB is wrong. AIIB is full-fledged, authentic international financial institutions. But still, some people misunderstand this. And when I say, and the reason why, my interpretation, I may be wrong, but Chinese government intention is to show China's willingness and the capacity to lead the creation of institutions which satisfies the current demand in Asia. So I don't think there's any, so China want to show willingness, capacity to create authentic international organization. That is my interpretation. There's no motivation to mix up national interests with such broad objective. So, and I'm not telling the people that MDBs always compete with each other. Of course, the co-financing is sometimes very good. And AIIB was very smart. When they start operation, they use co-financing properly. So I encourage them to work together, but I also want to see constructive competition among them. If we take a beneficiary first position, I think it's better to give all options, alternatives to potential beneficiaries from MDBs in Asia. Thank you.
I know you want to get to the questions from the audience, but I just want to ask one little small question. One of the early criticisms was the lack of a resident board. Has that been a problem?
So the idea of not having a resident board was one that was set at the moment when the bank was being developed as an initiative. So right from the outset there. So I was going to say that when the World Bank was established, there was a big discussion about whether it should have a resident board or not. And the United Kingdom, which along with the US was one of the two key players in putting all the arrangements together, it had argued very strongly that there should be a non-resident board. And its arguments were ultimately defeated by the US, which decided that there should be a resident board, because the idea was that there should be people available at the institution who could turn their minds to the needs of the institution and be always available. So I think that that was kind of the template for the multilateral development banks, or for most of them, with the exception of IFAD. But by the time the AIIB was established, I think that a couple of things had changed. One is that conceptually it was viewed as being more consistent with good governance if directors can confine themselves to the setting of the strategies, to the approving of the policies, the holding the presidency and the management accountable for their actions, rather than getting involved in the detail of the work of the institution, such as approving projects. So I think that had changed. And so in the charter of the AIIB, as elsewhere, the requirement for the authority for approving projects resides with the board, but there's a specific provision that contemplates the delegation of that power to the president. And in fact, that has now been put in place. So progressively, all the projects will eventually be approved by the president. So that's one thing that's different at the AIIB from the other organizations. And it means that the board has then less to do. So you don't really need to have a full-time board there. That was one reason. And then the second consideration is that the technology has changed. So prior to COVID, the AIIB was having 4 physical meetings of the board of directors every year, but it was also having ad hoc meetings by Zoom when necessary to approve a project out of the normal cycle, or to prepare directors for some policy initiative and so forth. And as we've all experienced now during COVID, it works quite well, notwithstanding the last minor blip. It normally works quite well to participate electronically. And so the AIIB, it's meeting with its board on average, I would say every 3 or 4 weeks, sometimes only for a few hours, but sometimes for many hours over several consecutive days. So for the AIIB, I think it works very well, the non-resident board, and maybe other organizations will draw some lessons from this as well. And I have to say too that having a resident board is very expensive, because if you have many directors, for example, the EBRD, which is a much smaller institution, there are 23 directors plus 23 alternate directors, and then they all have a couple of advisors, and they all need to have a secretary, and they all need to have an office, and so it's a lot of money. So it doesn't mean that it's not value for money at the EBRD. It's the EBRD's own judgment, but if the role of the board is slimmed down to take away the approval of projects, then maybe you don't need such a big board.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, the time is up, but I would like to continue, maybe 10 more minutes. So Asa is now okay, and yeah, you should. Okay. I have 3 questions. Now 2 person ask questions. So the panelists can review it. I think some of them are already answered, but probably the question is AIIB's long-term strategies for the synergy with maybe ADB and the other IFIs, and also some sort of some declining trust in China, recent instance with human rights issues of also the Hong Kong, and some sort of a political problem for any impact operation AIIB because of the China is a big host of the AIIB, and maybe the question, in fact, she quoted the HSP graduate, the Chinese, any sort of different legal systems encounters for the operations. So this is also my interest, in fact, because of the law reform assistance we provide in the EBRDs, how the AIIBs address these legal issues. The law is also kind of intangible infrastructures anyway, in a sense. It's important for, of course, operations. So I think how do you address AIIB address, especially the SDGs, goal 16 type of things for the related also anti-corruption and also some sort of rule of law, access to justice, these type of things. A little bit sensitive because related to the human rights issues. This is also the main points we are concerned. So could you just address very briefly, maybe 5 minutes, post Gerard? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yasu. So I think with regard to comments, I think we've touched on some of those issues already. Mm-hmm. What I would just say now is that in terms of the longer term approach, I think the AIIB will continue, where appropriate, to co-finance with others. So as I said, sometimes it will be because the co-financier has a better understanding of a particular product, which is true, for example, in relation to policy-based lending of the sort that the bank has been financing with the ADB and the World Bank. I think it would be true, as I said earlier, where some projects are just so large or so risky, or where there are other circumstances driving the multilaterals to co-finance. I think those situations will always be there. And of course, it's a way of mitigating political risk. So for the countries where the political risk is higher, it's very difficult to attract commercial sources of financing. So if you can have projects that are co-financed by not one, but two multilateral development banks, that probably mitigates the associated political risks to a very significant degree. So that co-financing will always be there. It's a question of how much there will be. And as I said, I think the AIIB wants to be, is in a position and will continue to be in a position whereby it can determine whether to finance projects alone or with others, depending on the interests of the client and the interests of the institution and the interests of the other co-financier. And in terms of the how the AIIB demonstrates its continued relevance, I think ultimately this will be something that's determined by demand. Are there countries, are there private sector investors in client countries that need the assistance of the AIIB and indeed of other international financial institutions? So if a country is doing especially well, it can probably attract other sources of financing. So the AIIB, one of the requirements under the Charter is before making an investment decision, the question should be asked, are there other sources of financing available which are reasonable? So that should be taken into account. So it means that usually all of the IFIs are lenders of last resort, and the AIIB is no different here. So I think it really depends on the nature of demand. When demand dries up, then the focus of the AIIB would have to change in a particular country, or might move away from financing projects in that country if it's no longer needed. There would be a good outcome, in fact, for everyone. And in very broad terms, I would say the ultimate demonstration there of whether the AIIB is successful is whether it can point to well-designed projects having been completed and which have been implemented, which are sustainable and environmentally friendly and so forth. So it's the projects that will be the real measure, I think, of the AIIB's operational success. And then in relation to how does the AIIB fare if around it the relations among some members is strong or is weak, this will always be the case, especially when you've got 103 approved members. Some members will have a very close association with other members, and some of them will show strains in their relationship. But the AIIB stands aside from all of that. So we are apolitical. We are, as I said before, we're required to take into account any economic considerations in our decision making, so we do not get involved in the relations among members. I also mentioned a bit earlier, we do have an international relations policy, which is designed to keep us away from problem areas, and that's a useful policy to have. And I think that's its existence just underscores the fact that the AIIB is apolitical and will seek to avoid being impacted by any deteriorating relations among members. Thank you very much. Sorry, there was one last question as well, which related to the problems caused by different kinds of legal systems and institutions. So here I would say that the issue is not so great in relation to sovereign operations, because in sovereign operations, the lending is directly to the state or is to a state-owned entity with a guarantee from the state. There is no conventional security, and the relationship between the state and the AIIB is very special. So the agreements, they are agreements that have the status of international agreements. They have treaty status. They're governed by public international law that enables the AIIB to impose its own international procurement rules. It enables the AIIB to disperse directly to the contractors and suppliers and consultants associated with projects. So in a way, for those sovereign operations, the AIIB is insulated from the shortcomings in any domestic law. It's a little bit different and more complex in relation to private sector projects, because in private sector projects, one has to engage with the local law. Sometimes the local law is sufficiently advanced that meaningful security can be obtained for projects, but sometimes it cannot be. And in those instances, the AIIB will still seek to support the development of a private sector project in a country that has weak systems. But it means that it will be just more difficult to do that. And of course, there are a number of modalities available to the institution to enable it to achieve that. One of which is to limit its own risk, not to put too much of its own capital at risk, but to mobilize co-financing from other institutions, from private sector financial institutions, and to use some financing tools that enable the commercial banks to benefit from the preferred creditor status of the AIIB. So there are some modalities that are available to mitigate the risks of dealing with financing private sector projects in countries that don't have very strong legal systems, but it is a challenge.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the almost 15 minutes passed from the planned time, but unfortunately, we have to close this webinar. But I will probably prepare some sort of feedback from the audience. If anyone who want to continue some questions, and I hope that Gerard is so generous enough to respond in some sense, in some way, through the internet, of course. Also, some sort of basic things are available. I don't know how University of Tokyo is now editing his intensive course, so should be uploaded on our homepage. So we will try to reach you. So finally, Lauren, you also won't have any comments, questions, but maybe you just guide us as a general moderator. So I don't have any sort of a closing remark at this point. Just this is a breakthrough for our frank discussion, and this is a good timing for us to think the future. We are heading for post-COVID-19, or even we have to adjust ourselves into this with COVID-19. Anyway, this disaster catastrophe demand unification or solidarity again. I hope this AIIB's initiative is not just the kind of negative things, more of the positive thing, to have a dialogue to everyone has a competition, but everyone has a so constructive passion and ideas. We are complement each other. So in this sense, this good to have a such a forum. Let us continue. So Gerard kindly offered another session, maybe volunteer himself for if we can open welcome Japan. So very sorry for I couldn't have you here in Tokyo, but anyway, thank you very much of the Nishizawa say and also the Arthur for such a very great discussion, the frank discussion that we really appreciate, and staff and also the audience. Sorry for my bad moderation, but I hope we will just start another session in the future. So, thank you very much. So, Lauren, can you just close?
Thank you very much, Professor Sato. I think today we've heard a great deal of promising information leading us to believe that it is possible to have progress towards the 2030 agenda and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals despite the great setbacks of COVID-19. And I'd like to thank all of the wonderful speakers that we've had in the audience for their great participation and time. In addition, I would like to second Professor Sato and invite people, given our constrained Q&A session, to please use the link to the form that's been provided to you in the chat, because we'd love to be able to know what you're thinking for any subsequent session that we might be able to provide. In addition, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, we'd be glad to pass those on to our speakers so that they might be able to provide an answer if they have time to do so. And once again, thank you very much. And good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.